The first thing Mira Navarin ever stole was a look. She'd been 14, hiding behind a packing crate on the observation platform of a transit hub. Watching an Imperial Moff stride through the crowds of Reland Station like the floor owed him something. She'd raised her father's old field optic scope, scratched brass and cracked housing, and looked through the lens at the Moff's face, and she'd understood, with a clarity that no one had bothered to teach her, that the galaxy had changed hands and the new owners didn't much care what happened to the goods they'd inherited. She was 31 now. The optic scope was still scratched, still cracked, and the man in her crosshairs wasn't a man at all. The Veth Dominant's forward appendages rested flat on the table like five-fingered hands, but they weren't hands. The joints bent inward, not out. The fingers, if you called them that, ended in translucent tips that glowed faintly blue when it communicated. A bioluminescent tick, a tell it probably didn't know it had. Mira had been watching it for 11 days from the ruined caretaker's suite 3 floors above the atrium, and she'd catalogued every tell. Blue pulse, satisfaction. Rapid triple flutter, stress response. Full dark, what she could only call lying. The Dominants called themselves the Veth Hierarchy. They had arrived 6 months ago in ships that looked less like vessels, and more like something living had been allowed to calcify around a drive core. They had hailed no government. They had presented no diplomats. They had simply begun to land, and the landing strips they chose were always, without exception, positioned over the gravity-heavy metal deposits that human geologists had known about for decades and left in the ground because extracting them required tearing the crust off a continent. The Veth didn't mind. They had taken Fenholm Station first, which most people had never heard of. Then the twin colony worlds of Brekka and Pell, which some people had heard of. Then the processing hub at Callus Major, which everyone had heard of. Because Callus Major was where 22% of the settled systems got their stabilized reactor fuel. The lights had gotten dimmer after Callast. Mira pressed the scope against her left eye and watched the Dominant sign a transfer document. Bioluminescence, blue bright and steady. It was pleased with whatever it was signing. The human translator beside it, a thin man in a gray uniform that didn't quite fit him, as if he'd borrowed it from someone who'd stopped needing it, kept his face carefully blank. She recognized the translator. His name was Paris Odell, and he'd been an attaché in the Colonial Foreign Service before the Veth arrived. Before the Veth arrived, Paris had been a man who believed in negotiation. She'd worked with him twice. He was good at it. Had a way of finding the thing both parties wanted more than what they were arguing about, and building a door out of that. She didn't know what Paris believed now. The document was a lease in perpetuity for the underground aquifer system beneath the city of Callaway's reach. 14 million people drank from that aquifer. The Veth didn't drink water, they processed mineral-dense brine, but the aquifer sat on top of a silicate iron formation 3 kilometers down that the hierarchy had decided it needed. 14 million people. Mira lowered the scope and exhaled slowly through her nose. She turned back to the folding table behind her, where a hand-drawn map of the building's sublevels was spread flat under 2 empty meal tins. Beside it, a handwritten notebook, pages fanned open to a diagram she'd made of the Dominant's daily movement pattern. Beside that, a battered field communicator with a cracked screen, a half-eaten protein bar, and a folded photograph she didn't look at directly but was always aware of. She heard Corvin before she saw him. He moved quietly for a large man, but the third step on the inner staircase had a loose riser that caught everyone. He ducked through the doorway and handed her a cloth-wrapped container of what passed for hot food in this district. Grain porridge with dried protein flakes that dissolved into something pretending to be broth. She accepted it and moved to give him space at the table. "Signing's done," she said. Corvin unwrapped his own container and looked at the map. He was 53. A former planetary surveyor with wide-spaced dark eyes and a scar from his left ear to the corner of his jaw that he'd gotten not in any fight but from a cable snap on a survey rig on Brekka 8 years before Brekka was taken. He talked about Brekka the way people talk about a relative who died badly, infrequently and carefully, with the edges of the words always a little too smooth, worn down from private repetition. Movement schedule still holds for tomorrow, near as I can tell. She ate a spoonful of porridge. Dominant exits the atrium at the first bell, crosses the transit courtyard, enters the relay station, exits at second bell for what they're calling a site review, which is the aquifer assessment, and the escort, 4 subordinate class units. They're not soldiers. Corvin looked at her. "They're not," she said. "I've watched them for 11 days. They carry pulse weapons, but they're using them like status markers. The subordinates are administrators. They process, they file. They don't cross-train for field work. The Veth hierarchy doesn't expect field work because they've never had anyone push back. Corvin was quiet for a moment, eating his porridge with the deliberate patience of a man who understood that eating was something he needed to do, whether or not he felt like it. You've said that before, he said, that they haven't had pushback. It's relevant. I know it's relevant. I'm just thinking about what it means when something that's never had pushback finally gets it. Mira thought about the Moff she'd watched through the scope when she was 14, how he'd walked, what had been in his face. Not arrogance exactly. Arrogance was a kind of performance, a signal broadcast outward. What she'd seen in the Moff's face was simpler and more total than that. It was the absolute absence of the idea that the situation could be otherwise. She'd wondered, sometimes, whether that was learned, whether someone had taught him to feel that way, layer by layer, year by year, until it was as natural as breathing. She didn't know if the Veth had learned it or been born with it. She suspected it didn't matter. They recalibrate, she said. Or they don't. But either way, they learn for the first time that recalibration is necessary. And that window, between first contact and recalibration, is what we have. Corvin set down his empty container and pulled the movement pattern diagram toward himself, turning it with one finger. You want to talk about the other thing, he said. I don't want to. We have to. There are 14 million people in Calloway's Reach who would rather we found another way. I know that. I'm one of them. If there's another way, I want to find it. She paused. There isn't, I've looked. The other thing was the relay station. The Veth hierarchy communicated through a layered signal system that human technicians had spent the better part of 3 months trying to decode. They'd managed to crack the outer layer. The administrative traffic, the logistics, the sort of thing that told you where a convoy was going, but not why. The inner layers were still closed. The inner layers, according to everyone with the expertise to know, were where the hierarchy transmitted its actual decisions. The choices about which deposits to extract, which populations to relocate, which infrastructure to absorb. If you could get into the relay station and access the transmission core during an active signal cycle, you could insert a carrier wave that would ride the inner layer all the way back to the hierarchy's home network and leave a ghost in the system, a listener, passive, invisible. Months of real intelligence instead of months of guessing. The relay station sat inside the Veth administrative complex. The dominant crossed through the transit courtyard every morning at first bell. I can do the relay on my own, Mira said. You stay with the extraction team. The extraction team has 4 people who've never done a building breach. 3 of them have done cargo hold deconstructions, which is the same skill set. The 4th has an architecture background and knows the sublevels better than anyone. Mira, I can do it. He looked at her for a long time in the way he did sometimes when he was deciding whether to say the real thing he was thinking. She'd known Corvin for 11 years. She'd met him on Brekka, at a colonial resource conference where neither of them had been there for the conference. He was one of maybe 4 people in the settled systems she trusted with her back turned, and one of 2 she trusted with her back turned in the dark. I know you can do it, he said finally. That's not what I'm asking. Then what are you asking? I'm asking whether you want to survive it. The folded photograph was visible in her peripheral vision. She didn't look at it. I want to finish it, she said. He nodded once slowly, as if that was the answer he'd expected, and maybe the only one that made sense. The morning of the operation, Mira woke before the light changed and lay still in her sleeping role for exactly 4 minutes, which was a habit she'd developed on her second field deployment and had never managed to break. 4 minutes of lying still and letting the day arrive. Not thinking, not planning. Just being in the room, in the body, aware of the weight of both. She rose, dressed, and ate the last of the protein bars. She checked her equipment for the 3rd time, though she'd checked it the night before and the night before that. The checking wasn't really about the equipment, it was about her hands. Whether they were steady, whether she was where she needed to be inside herself. They were. She was. She took the photograph out and looked at it. Her sister's face looked back at her. Younger, the photograph was 7 years old. Kale had been 24, standing in the forecourt of the university building on Brekka, where she'd been finishing her doctoral work, squinting into the sun with the particular squint of someone who'd forgotten their eye shields and wasn't going to admit it. She was laughing at something just outside the frame. Breccia had been taken 2 years later. The university building was a mineral processing intake facility now, according to the survey satellite images. The forecourt was a transit pad. Mira folded the photograph and put it back. The transit courtyard was 40 meters wide, paved with the pale flat stone that the Veth hierarchy favored for surfaces it intended to use. They laid it over everything they occupied, as if they were erasing the substrate. It was early. The light was thin and silver gray, the kind of morning light that made everything look slightly provisional, like a set still being dressed. Mira was in the building on the courtyard's eastern edge, behind the filter screen of a maintenance access panel, watching. The dominant emerged from the atrium's northern door at first bell, precisely as it had for 11 days. 4 subordinates, 2 on either side. The dominant was taller than the subordinates, nearly 2 meters. And its coloring was darker, a deep blue-gray that shaded toward purple at the extremities. It moved with a quality that was hard to name exactly. Not slow but thorough, as if each step was completed rather than taken. Mira watched it cross the courtyard. She had the field optic scope up and through it she could see the dominant's bioluminescent tips. Blue-bright, satisfied, routine. It was doing what it always did, and it had no reason to expect otherwise. That was the window. She moved. The maintenance corridor behind the filter screens ran the length of the building's eastern face and guided, at the third intersection, to a utility crawl that had been cut through the shared wall between the eastern building and the relay station when both buildings were still under human administration. A data conduit route, now disused. Half collapsed in one section but passable if you'd measured it first and knew exactly where to put your shoulders. She'd measured it. She knew. She counted her breaths in the dark of the crawl. The collapsed section was tight. She flattened herself and moved on her forearms, face inches from the crumbled substrate, feeling the weight of the wall pressing down on the space around her. Not on her, around her. She kept the distinction precise in her mind because the distinction was what kept her moving. She came out in a utility alcove behind the relay station's secondary processing bank. The station's interior smelled wrong. Not bad exactly, but chemically specific in a way that reminded her of the inside of the hierarchy ships she'd been briefed on. A dry, faintly metallic scent, like ozone and scorched copper. The processing banks were not human standard. They were taller, darker, and completely unlabeled in any script she could read. Though she'd had enough time with intercepted hierarchy technical documents to recognize shapes and positions. The transmission core was in the center of the room. She knew this because every transmission core in every Veth relay station, across every installation they'd built, was in the center of the room. She knew this from 6 months of intelligence work by a team of people who'd spent their nights in borrowed rooms, looking at stolen documents under insufficient light. And she knew it in the specific worked-for way that you know things when you've learned them at some cost. She moved to the core. The carrier wave insertion required a physical splice, a piece of equipment no larger than her thumb, engineered by a woman named Desh, who'd spent 20 years in signals intelligence, and who had handed Mira the device with the care of someone handing over something irreplaceable and saying goodbye to it. "You'll have 40 seconds from first contact to full insertion," Desh had said. "After that, the system will detect the anomaly and purge. You won't get a second pass." Mira had asked if 40 seconds was enough. 38 is enough, Desh had said. "If you know where you're going and you don't hesitate." She found the interface, a recessed panel on the core's lower third, hexagonal, color-keyed in the frequency range that matched active signal cycles. It was open. The cycle was running. She inserted the device. 1. The device's embedded processor began its handshake sequence, a faint vibration in her fingertips. She counted. 10. From somewhere above her, upstairs she thought, the upper administrative level, a subordinate was moving. She could hear the floor weight of it, the particular dense footfall of Veth physiology, heavier than it looked. It wasn't moving quickly. It was moving with the same thoroughness as the dominant in the courtyard, completing each step. 20. The vibration changed. The device was past the outer layer. Somewhere in the hierarchy's vast distributed network, a ghost was finding its footing, settling into the signal like a passenger who'd been waiting at the stop long enough to know exactly which car to board. 30. The footsteps stopped. She didn't look up. 35. She heard the upper door open. 38. The device pulsed once, twice, then went still in a way that was different from the stillness before. Complete, settled, done. She pulled it free. She looked up. The subordinate was in the doorway. It was looking at her. Its bioluminescent tips were going through a rapid sequence. Not the triple flutter of stress she'd catalogued, but something faster and more complex. Something she hadn't seen before. She was aware, with a calm she noted dispassionately as probably not rational, that she was looking at something experiencing genuine surprise. Not alert surprise, not threat response, the other kind. The kind that happened when a thing encountered a situation it had no template for. She had maybe 4 seconds before it resolved the surprise into action. She thought of Corvin asking if she wanted to survive it. She moved toward the door. The subordinate raised its pulse weapon, that status marker, that filing accessory, and in the half-second before it fired, she was already going sideways, and the pulse went into the processing bank behind her, with a sound like a hard rain on a metal roof. And she was through the door and into the corridor, and she was running. The maintenance crawl was behind her. Ahead was the service stair she'd mapped as extraction route secondary. She took it. Below, she could hear the courtyard alarm. Not a human standard alarm. The Veth used a sub-auditory tone that resonated in the chest cavity rather than the ears. A feeling more than a sound. The feeling of something very large paying attention in your direction. She hit the ground floor and went south. The extraction team was at the service entrance on the building's south face. She'd told them to be ready to move regardless of whether she made it, because the extraction was the asset. The records they'd pulled from the atrium administrative files, the survey data, the 3 hierarchy technical officers who'd agreed to provide testimony in exchange for resettlement. Corvin was at the door. He looked at her. She looked at him. There was no time for the conversation, and they both knew it, and the knowing of it was its own conversation. Package, she said. 3 for 3 records secured. Go they went. The safe house was a cellar beneath a bakery that had been closed for 2 years, located in the district of Callaway's Reach that the hierarchy had classified as low resource priority. No deposits beneath it worth the extraction cost, so no occupation. The bread smell had never fully left. It lived in the walls, warm and faintly sweet, and Mira found that she was intensely glad of it in a way she couldn't have predicted and didn't try to analyze. They sat on repurposed equipment crates and drank water, and nobody said anything for a while, which was appropriate. One of the hierarchy technical officers, a subordinate who'd requested to be called Ison, which might or might not have been its actual designation, sat apart from the group and appeared to be engaged in some internal process that Mira was not qualified to interpret. Its bioluminescent tips pulsed slowly and irregularly. She watched it without appearing to watch it. Finally, Corvin said, "The device, planted and live," she said. "Signal confirmed on insertion. We won't know if the ghost took hold for another 2 weeks. 2 weeks. 2 weeks minimum. Maybe 4. He nodded and looked at the floor and then at the scene and then back at the floor, the way he did when he was calculating something with variables he didn't fully trust. "We have the testimony," she said. "We have the survey files, which means we have proof of the aquifer seizure and the relocation plans for 6 other cities. That's already more than we came here with. It's not enough to stop it, no, but it might be enough to make them slow down. Slowing down buys time. Time is the thing." Corvin was quiet for a moment. "My surveyor's brain keeps trying to find the geometry of this," he said. "How big they are, how many systems they've taken, how far back we'd have to go in human history to find an equivalent, and whether that equivalent ever resolved in a direction we'd call good. What does your surveyor's brain conclude?" He looked up. The lines around his eyes were deep and tired, and also, under all of it, precise. The precision of a man who had spent his career measuring things other people overlooked. "I've never seen a formation that didn't have at least one fault line," he said. "The bigger they are, the more of their weight they're carrying, and weight over time finds the fault lines." Mira looked at the photograph in her pocket. Didn't take it out, just felt it there. "We find the fault line," she said. Asen spoke for the first time in the safe house, 4 hours after they arrived. It spoke in the trade pidgin it had learned from the human attachés, halting with a syntax that kept inverting itself, subject where the object should be, verb where the noun expected to live, but clear enough. "I want to ask a question," it said, "if the asking is permitted." Everyone looked at it. Mira nodded. "Why do you continue?" it said. She considered the question seriously, because it seemed to deserve that. "What do you mean by continue?" "You have lost much. You lose more each interval. The hierarchy's resource acquisition trajectory shows no viable terminus in your favor by any model we use. The rational behavior is," it paused, searching, "accommodation, integration. It is what most of the species we have encountered eventually choose." "How many species have you encountered?" 23 that were capable of the kind of activity you demonstrated today. 17 of them chose accommodation within 30 to 40 of your years. And the other 6? Its bioluminescent tips flickered. That rapid complex sequence she'd seen in the relay station. Surprise, she thought, or something adjacent to it. The other 6, it said carefully, are still a matter of active evaluation. Mira looked at Corvin. He looked back at her. There was something in his face. Not quite amusement. Not quite satisfaction. But the quiet, specific expression of a man whose calculation has just been handed a new variable. That's your answer, she said to Ison. I don't understand it. I know. She leaned back against the cool wall and felt the ache of the morning's work beginning to settle into her shoulders and her knees. You've met 23 species. 6 of them are still being evaluated. That number should mean something to you. It means 6 species have caused disproportionate resource expenditure in relation to their scale. Or, she said, it means 6 species found the fault line. Ison's tips went quiet, fully dark. She waited to see whether that was the lying dark or something else. When they came back on, they were a color she hadn't cataloged before. Not blue satisfaction, not flutter stress. Something slower and more measured. She made a note of it. The ghost took hold in 19 days. The first intercept arrived as a data packet that looked, to all external scans, like a hierarchy logistics update about mineral convoy routing on a system 400 light-years from Callaway's reach. Inside it, riding a frequency that Desh's device had specifically engineered to survive packet stripping, was a compressed transmission log from a hierarchy-dominant council meeting. Mira sat in the cellar of the bakery and translated it line by line with Ison's help, her handwritten notes covering 4 pages of paper before she reached the thing that made her stop. The hierarchy had 17 worlds in active extraction. 3 of those 17 had exceeded the projected yield models. The hierarchy was experiencing resource surplus. She looked at Ison. A surplus, she said. You have more than you need. The hierarchy requires ongoing acquisition, it said carefully. To cease acquisition is to signal. To signal what? It didn't answer immediately. Its tips did the slow, unmapped color she'd first seen 4 days ago. The color she'd started thinking of as something like uncertain. Stasis, it said finally. To cease acquisition is to signal stasis. And stasis, in hierarchy cosmology, is the state that precedes dissolution. Mira thought about this. So you keep taking, she said, not because you need what you're taking, but because stopping would mean admitting you didn't need to keep going. Ison was quiet for a long time. That is a reductive framing, it said at last. Is it inaccurate? Another long quiet. No, it said. It is not inaccurate. Corvin, who had been listening from across the cellar, let out a long, careful breath. There is a particular quality to the moment, when a thing you've believed because you needed to believe it finally becomes a thing you know because you've seen it. The feeling is not exactly relief. It's more like a weight becoming load-bearing, shifting from something you were carrying to something you could stand on. We had believed, from the beginning, that the Veth hierarchy was not inevitable, that the 23 species, the 17 accommodations, the 6 still open evaluations were a record of encounters, not a law of nature. She had believed this the way she'd believed, at 14 looking through a scratched field optic scope at a moth's blank and absolute face, that the galaxy had changed hands, but hands could change again. She knew it now. The surplus data went out through 3 separate channels simultaneously to the coalition of surviving independent systems that had been attempting to negotiate, to the 2 hierarchy dominant council members who Ison had identified as belonging to what it called the conservative acquisition faction, and to the 3 remaining free press networks that were still operating, barely, in the outer settlements. She didn't know which channel would do the most work. That wasn't her call to make. Her part was getting the information to the people who could use it, and trusting that information, honestly obtained and honestly delivered, had a velocity of its own. Corvin found her on the roof of the bakery that evening, looking at the city. Callaway's reach spread below them in the early dark, still lit, still full of people doing the million ordinary things people did when they were trying to keep their lives going in a world that had been repositioned beneath them without their consent. She could see on the far edge of the skyline the pale, flat stone of the Veth administrative complex, lit from within in that particular blue-white frequency the hierarchy favored. You should eat something, Corvin said. I ate. More than a protein bar. It's a figure of speech. I had actual food. Ison made something. I don't know what it was, but it had more than 2 ingredients and it was warm. He sat down beside her on the low parapet wall, and they were quiet for a while, looking at the city. "The 6 species," he said eventually. "Yeah, you think we're one of them. I think we're becoming one of them. I think there's a difference between the ones that were and the ones that are becoming. And the difference is whether you've found the fault line yet." He was quiet. Somewhere below, in one of the lit windows, she could see a family sitting down to a meal, the shapes of them clear through the glass. 2 adults, 3 children. Someone at the far end she couldn't quite make out. An ordinary evening. An ordinary thing that the hierarchy, with its surplus and its fear of stasis, and its 23 species, and its unbroken record of accommodation, had decided to put at risk in exchange for an aquifer it didn't need. "What do you do?" Corvin said. "If this doesn't work? If the surplus data doesn't shift the coalition, or the conservative faction doesn't have enough standing, or the press networks get shut down before?" "Then we find the next fault line," she said. "Just like that. Just like that." She looked at him. "I watched you on Breccia once when the survey company told you they were pulling the team and closing the site. You'd been working that site for 3 years. You'd found more there than they'd expected, and less than the company needed for the extraction to be profitable. So they were pulling the team and mothballing it. You sat with that news for about 30 seconds. And then you asked when the next survey window was." He was quiet for a moment. "That was a mineral site," he said. "Yes," she said. "And this is 14 million people, and 6 species and 19 days for a ghost to take hold in a system that's never had one. The principle's the same." He laughed then, not the careful, rationed laugh of a man managing his morale, but something short and real, and a little surprised at itself. The laugh of a man who has just been told something true in a way he hadn't expected. Below in the lit window, the family was passing something around the table. She watched them for a moment, the shapes of them, the ordinary human ceremony of sharing food, and felt the photograph in her pocket, and thought of Kale squinting into the sun on a forecourt that was now a transit pad, on a world that was now a mine. The grief was there. It was always going to be there. She'd stopped waiting for it to leave. What she'd found instead, what she had now, in addition to the grief, was the specific and stubborn knowledge that the transit pad could become a forecourt again. That it wasn't cosmological law. That Kale's laugh, preserved in a 7-year-old photograph on a forecourt that had been erased, was a data point in a series that was not yet complete. 6 species, still under evaluation. She raised the field optic scope, scratched brass, cracked housing, her father's gift, and her own years of use, and looked at the city, all of it. Every lit window, every moving figure, every ordinary irreplaceable thing going about the work of continuing to exist. "We're going to need the next survey window," she said. "I know," Corvin said. Below them, Calloway's reach held its light against the dark, the way it had before the hierarchy arrived, the way it intended to go on doing.